Hello, I would like to tell you a little bit about heavy metal music today. Music is an influential art. Rock and roll came from folk music. Blues music came from rock and roll. R&B, jazz, hip hop, all these different types of music influence each other or were influenced by other types of music. And one thing I want to tell you about heavy metal music is who was the first heavy metal band, and that was Black Sabbath. I will tell you why I say it was Black Sabbath. There were a lot of bands, people argue all the time about who was the first band, and there were a lot of bands that did do heavy metal music, but they experimented with it. They weren't a heavy metal band. And that's how music is created. That's how types of music become their own type, is people experimenting and trying new things. And a lot of these bands did that, but they didn't sustain it. The first band to dedicate their whole music to that heavy metal was Black Sabbath. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the influential music that started heavy metal. I'll tell you about Black Sabbath, how they came to be and how they started heavy metal music. And then I'll tell you about some of the influences that they did themselves. Now, heavy metal music is low, scratchy, raw tones, loud guitars, loud drums, thumping bass, psychedelic rock, elongated guitar solos, almost dark, eerie lyrics. Some of the first bands that influenced heavy metal music were Kinks and Cream. Now, a lot of people you might know about the Kinks, like songs like You Really Got Me Now. They came out with a scratchy, loud guitar, and they hadn't been heard before. And that was in 1964. In 1967, Cream came out with a song called Sunshine of Your Love. It was psychedelic. It was alternative drumming, this style that had never really been heard before. And these bands were experimenting with this. They were rock and roll, they were thrashy, they were hard, and they'd never been heard before. And it paved the way for those styles, but it wasn't heavy metal. It was missing some of the aspects of it. The Who came out with one of the first songs that was almost heavy metal. And they came out in 1967, and I Can See for Miles. Paul McCartney from the Beatles quoted about that song, saying it was the loudest song he had ever heard. And that inspired him to create and write the song Helter Skelter. And a lot of critics say that that was the first metal song. I can't disagree with that, but I don't quite agree with it. There are some other songs that came out around that same exact time that are arguably heavy metal songs as well. But that doesn't make them a heavy metal band. And the Beatles are rock and roll through and through. Everybody knows that. So if you make a heavy metal song, that doesn't mean you're heavy metal. If they came out with a country song, that wouldn't make them country. Moving on to other bands, after those footsteps was Jimi Hendrix Experience. Songs like Are You Experienced? Many of their other songs held out low-tone blues and high squealing guitars. Jimi Hendrix also led in the long solos, these elongated solos that hadn't really been that long before. And Led Zeppelin was right after their footsteps. They were just trailing them on the path to heavy metal. And they came out with these songs too. However, in that time, there was a band that came out. And they started doing the same thing, but that's all they did. They weren't experimenting. They already knew their sound. And that band was Black Sabbath. Now let me take a step back. Right before Black Sabbath became Black Sabbath, a few years before Led Zeppelin and Hendrix, while they were still creating their bands, Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi got together and created a band called the Toca Blues Band. Now, they wanted a heavy blues sound, and it's almost like they created it in their mind. And they were obviously influenced by these other bands. But they wanted something more than just a thrashy hard sound like the Kinks or psychedelic tones like Cream. But they couldn't find it. And one day in rehearsal, they went out on a break. And as the two were standing outside on a street having a cigarette, they noticed across the street there was this big movie theater. And they said Black Sabbath. And it was a horror film. They commented to each other, man, there's just people all the way down around the building just trying to get in to see this movie. And they watched it as it got sold out, and people were still standing around trying to get in anyways. And Tony Iommi commented to Ozzy Osbourne and said, looks like we're in the wrong career. We need to be in the movie business, not the music business. We're not making any money. Well, it sparked an idea that the two came up with. Why not take that horror theme that sells so well in movies and put it into music? So they had these psychedelic tones and these thrashy guitars and this loud thumping drums and these elongated solos from these different influences. And if they put it all together and put some dark tone into their lyrics, that's metal. They didn't know it at the time, but they created a whole new genre of music. And from that day on, brought path many different types of heavy metal. One of the big things that led the path for them to make that sound, beyond a thrashy guitar, and like the Beatles slashing their bass amp to make that thrash sound. A lot of other bands did similar things. But beyond that, Tony Iommi, on an all-accident account, had another job when they were still working on building their band up. And he had lost parts of his fingers on his left hand. That's his guitar hand. So he had these little prosthetics, and they wouldn't work well. They were, in his late 60s, you can't get really good prosthetics. So he had to mesh on the guitar. And it came out real raw, almost scratchy sounding, beyond what the normal amp messed up could do. And this gave more of a metal sound. And that's what created heavy metal. Some of the bands they influenced went on to do other things. You have hair metal, you have thrash metal, garage metal, many other types of metal. Some bands, for example, Megadeth, Metallica, Pantera, Twisted Sister, Motley Crue, and Def Leppard. A lot of other bands and different styles of metal was created from that. But Black Sabbath started it all. Now I talked to you a little bit about some of the influences of different bands from different times that helped create metal. And it's easy to say that the Beatles or the Who, Cream, the Kinks, one of these other bands created heavy metal. But they had their own part in it. They all helped build a frame for a door. But it took a band to create heavy metal, to open that door. And that was Black Sabbath. I told you about how they came to be and how they created heavy metal. And I told you about some of the influences that they did. Now, with a shadow of doubt, you know Black Sabbath created heavy metal. I would like to thank you for your time, and I'll have any questions for you. I can answer them after the speech.